Excellent. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining today for our VCAN webinar, where we will be providing an update on the Climate Superfund and the Resilience Implementation Strategy. My name is Lauren Hurl, and I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Natural Resources Council. And VNRC is a statewide nonprofit organization that since 1963 has used research, education, collaboration, and advocacy to protect and enhance Vermont's natural environments, vibrant communities, productive working landscapes, rural character, and unique sense of place. And as many of you know on this call, one important priority of VNRC is helping coordinate VCAN, the Vermont Energy and Climate Action Network. And of course, VCAN is a network of partner organizations and town energy committees doing critical work in communities around the state on projects to cut energy costs, reduce pollution, and help our communities adapt and become more resilient in a climate-changed world. And this is the second to last webinar in VCAN's winter webinar series. Our last webinar will be on May 7th at noon, and it's going to be an energy leader peer-to-peer roundtable. So don't forget to sign up for that, and we'll put info on how to sign up later in the webinar. And before we get into the meat of today, just noting that yesterday we celebrated the 55th Earth Day, and a number of organizations and advocates gathered at the State House. There was a press event and a rally. We were joined by a number of statewide leaders, including Attorney General Charity Clark, Secretary of State Sarah Copeland-Hansis, Treasurer Mike Pichak, the Senate President Pro Tem joined us, and we had a message from the Speaker of the House. And really the message was just reaffirming Vermont's commitment to a clean and healthy environment for all, even at a time when we know that we're seeing a number of federal attacks in, a huge wide range of ways, but that our leaders are looking through all the different avenues we can use in the courts, at state legislature, in funding important investments in our communities. So it was a fun event, great to just see everybody standing up and making clear that this work goes on and that, we're going to do everything we can, even in these challenging times. And I think this environment that we're in really underscores the importance of state level work that we can do, things like holding oil companies accountable and building Vermont's resilience, the two topics we're going to really dig into today. So we're going to hear more about the Climate Superfund. That is, again, the nation-leading law enacted in 2024 to hold the largest fossil fuel companies accountable for helping pay for the damages their products are causing in Vermont. And then we'll hear about the Resilience Implementation Strategy, a project initiated by the Governor and Treasurer Pichak, which will provide an important framework to inform state, regional, and community planning and priority investments and critical strategies to make our state more resilient. So quick logistics for today. Please stay muted, but do put your questions and thoughts in the chat. We'll track all your questions and we'll have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. And I'm just really delighted to be joined today by some great panelists to dig into these topics. First, we're going to hear from Ben Edgerly Walsh. He's the Climate and Energy Program Director at the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, VPIRG, and he'll be focusing on the Climate Superfund and status of implementation. Next, we're going to hear from Marian Wolz, Resilience and Adaptation Coordinator in the Climate Action at our Agency of Natural Resources. And she'll be discussing ANR's work on the Resilience Implementation Strategy. And then finally, we'll hear from Ashlynn Doyon, who will discuss the Office of the Treasurer's work to update us on the Resilience Implementation Strategy and their role in it. And then we'll get to your questions. So I'm going to turn it right over to Ben.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Pleasure to be speaking with VCAM members yet again, something I've done many times over the years. Go ahead and just jump right into the next slide. I'm going to be just buzzing through the structure of the Climate Superfund Act, quickly the sort of order of operations that it set in motion when it passed last year. And then I'm going to be getting into, as Lauren said, what's actually happened since enactment and what's going on right now in the legislature as it relates to it. So as folks know, the Climate Superfund Act is a law designed to require the largest, some of the largest fossil fuel companies in the world, the ones that have some sort of legal or physical footprint in the state, to pay their fair share of the cost of the climate crisis to the state of Vermont. And there are a number of steps between its passage and when those checks will actually come in the door, if all goes according to plan. The first one, which you're going to be hearing a lot more about in just a minute, and so I will be very brief on, is the adoption of a resilience implementation strategy for the state of Vermont. That's something that ball that had gotten in motion from the administration and the treasurer before this bill was introduced last year, and essentially the Climate Superfund Act incorporated this idea into the law. This is, I shorthanded, and Marian can tell you all if this is correct or not, as sort of a prioritized plan and inventory of resilience, adaptation, and response efforts to the climate crisis that also is going to attempt to catalog the costs of those and potential funding streams. So that's step one. That work is very much underway right now. Step two, the state treasurer is required to come up with a report that estimates the cost of the climate crisis, specifically the cost of fossil fuel emissions globally over the last 30 years to the state of Vermont. That includes both damage being done to the state, impacts on the economy, et cetera, and the cost of resilience and adaptation and climate response efforts. Next slide. Then you've got the rulemaking the Agency of Natural Resources is required to do, which essentially is trying to figure out what portion of global fossil fuel emissions from the last 30 years each of the companies that Vermont can legally reach are responsible for. And that's the portion of the costs from the treasurer's report that those companies will be required to pay. In step four, the issuance of the cost recovery demands to these companies. Again, we don't know exactly how big these are going to be because the treasurer's office hasn't finished that cost estimate yet. But you can ballpark it to be probably something in the hundreds of millions of dollars that would ultimately come to the state of Vermont. That's an educated guess. We'll see in the coming years what those numbers actually look like. Next slide. Finally, the Climate Superfund Cost Recovery Program Fund, a bit of a mouthful. Essentially, this is where the money would go, would then be managed by the Agency of Natural Resources, significantly informed by the resilience implementation strategy we just discussed. And essentially, this money would be used for climate adaptation, resilience, and response. So it's important to understand this is not a program that's intended to cut carbon pollution, et cetera, et cetera. It is really on the resilience and adaptation side of the ledger. Although some of the investments that would be made through it, would be enabled through it, could also have happy side effects of reducing pollution. For instance, installing a super efficient HVAC system in a school so that students don't have to worry about staying home on very hot days, or weatherizing Vermonters' homes. Those are things that are both resilience and mitigation investments, and that would be part of the work that could be funded through this program. Next slide. So I wanted to just quickly get you up to speed on what's happened since the law went into effect. So the first thing I just want to note right up top is the state is being sued by I'm sorry, I put the wrong acronym in there. That's Americans for Prosperity. They're doing all sorts of other bad stuff. American Petroleum Institute, which is the trade association for all the big oil and gas and coal companies in the country. And then you've got the U.S. Chamber of Commerce joining them in that lawsuit. This is not unexpected. Everyone in the legislature voting on this understood that there was very likely to be a lawsuit. And that's essentially because these companies don't want to be held financially accountable. They've resisted every attempt anywhere in the world to hold them financially accountable to date. So it's no shock that they're doing it here. And the kinds of legal arguments they're throwing at this are exactly what the legislature expected and what they got pretty extensive testimony on. We're confident the law is on solid legal ground, but ultimately that's going to be up to the courts to decide, and the Attorney General is all over this. So getting into what's actually been going on with the law, last fall, the Treasurer's Office and ANR, actually led by ANR, put out what's called a request for information. This is essentially before you do work like this that you might want to hire consultants for, you put out a request to experts in the field for information about the work that you're considering doing. So they got a number of responses back from academics in a number of different fields, very promising for the state's ability to ultimately be able to bring on board the expertise they need to do both the Treasurer's work and ANR's work that I just described. Next, in January, you had the feasibility report that the Agency of Natural Resources was required to come out with in this law in consultation with the Treasurer's office. Essentially, it was looking into, like, can this really be done? Do we need more resources? Do we need more time? Just getting the legislature a preliminary report back on that, the law and the components of it. And it's a dozen, 15 pages, something like that. So I will distill it very briefly to essentially, yes, this is doable work. We got a lot of good RFI responses. The experts are out there. It's just about the resources and the time that we need to do it. And ANR and the Treasurer's office asked for a little bit more of both time and money to get this work done in a rigorous way. Before I get into the specific things that are happening in this legislative session, then I'll wrap and turn it over to Marian. I just wanted to note, folks probably heard that Trump came out with an executive order just over 2 weeks ago that targeted local and state climate action broadly in this country, but named 3 laws in particular: Vermont's Climate Superfund Act, the equivalent law that New York passed shortly after Vermont passed ours, their Climate Superfund Act, and the Cap and Invest program in California, as 3 ones that Trump really particularly doesn't like and wants the U.S. Attorney General to go after. So we don't know exactly what they're going to do. Again, this was not unexpected. This is a president who is, very much in the corner of big oil, and is, no surprise that he's fighting for them instead of American citizens. Ultimately, we don't know what this will result in. I would say it's not unlikely that the administration would try to get involved in the lawsuit in some way, but we'll see. Okay, lastly, amendments and funding that's being pushed for this legislative session. Looks like one of the bullets fell off the bottom of the slide, but there are 3 things going on that I wanted to highlight. One, the deadlines for this law are being pushed back by 12 months. That is totally reasonable. We're supportive of it. And essentially that would mean that the earliest money would come in would be late 2028, early 2029, instead of a year before that. The simple rationale here is this is work that no state's done before, to do this kind of comprehensive assessment and issue cost recovery demands. And so the Treasurer's office and ANR need a little bit more time to do their due diligence, to do this work in a really rigorous and robust way. Second, the resilience implementation strategy you're going to hear about in a minute, that's being right in the initial law that was required to be done through rulemaking. I won't get into the particulars of what that entails, but just suffice it to say it's a pretty inflexible, very lengthy process that's appropriate in some cases, but not really necessary here for the kind of work that you're going to hear more about in a minute. So we're supportive of that not having to be done through rulemaking. The bill being considered would also add additional reporting and essentially in place of the rulemaking from ANR. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the legislature is considering funding for the implementation of this law for both ANR and the Treasurer's office. It looks like right now, maybe even later this afternoon, the Senate Appropriations Committee is going to be supporting funding for the implementation of this law. Probably not the full request that's been put forward, but a substantial piece of it. And at a minimum, it'll allow the Treasurer's office, which is again that sort of first big piece of analysis that's required after the resilience implementation strategy, to do their work. So that's the quick update. As Lauren mentioned, happy to answer any questions. Drop them in the chat. But that's what I've got for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ben. And now we're going to transition to Marian from ANR.
Great. Well, thanks, Ben, for that overview, and thanks to Lauren and team at VNRC and VCAN for the invitation. Happy to chat with you all about the work we're doing to develop a resilience implementation strategy. Next slide, please. So on July 3rd of 2024, Governor Scott and Treasurer Pichek announced the development of a resilience implementation strategy, which is a joint initiative to identify and prioritize climate resilience needs and evaluate the sufficiency of currently available funding. The Resilience Implementation Strategy, or RIS as we call it, is intended to build off work done to date across state government to focus on how state government's work can help better support Vermonters in building resilience to the impacts of climate change, recognizing the severe flooding we've experienced over the last couple of years, but also impacts from drought, severe winter storms, and other changes that we're seeing because of human-caused climate change. In the face of increasing in severity of those particular events and hazards, it was noted that integrating all of the work state government does into a comprehensive strategy will help us better understand where there are gaps, opportunities, help us guide and prioritize ongoing efforts, and identify approaches for implementation. The development of this resilience implementation strategy is being led by myself and folks in the Climate Action Office in close partnership with Ashlynn and others in the Treasurer's Office, with support from a steering committee made up of representatives from various state agencies and departments, as well as the Vermont State Climatologist. And I should say, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Marian Wolz. I'm the Resilience and Adaptation Coordinator in the Climate Action Office. We sit within the Agency of Natural Resources, but help coordinate state-led climate initiatives across state government. All right, next slide, please. So walking you all through sort of where we are in the process of developing the resilience implementation strategy, wanted to ground us first in a definition of climate resilience. And apologies, a lot of text on the slide here, but we'll leave it up for a minute for folks to be able to read. So as we began the process of developing a resilience implementation strategy, we worked closely with our steering committee to develop a definition of climate resilience, building off of the definition that is used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This definition is broad in focus and really defines climate resilience as not only the actions we might take to reduce our long-term risks to climate change, but also the actions we might take to help us better anticipate, withstand, respond to, and recover from climate-impacted disasters. This definition recognizes the interconnected systems of ecological resilience, community resilience, and economic resilience are really core to what makes us resilient in Vermont and in our own communities. Next slide, please. So as we begin looking at what could be included in the resilience implementation strategy, again, acknowledging the core focus of this work and this initiative is on the work that state government does to build up resilience in our state and in our communities. The resilience implementation strategy and the recommendations that come out of it will focus on 5 core areas that you'll see lined up on the bottom of the slide here. And these 5 core areas recognize the interconnected community, ecological, and economic systems that serve as the basis for us to be resilient as communities and as a state. So I'll walk through those 5 here and talk about sort of the broad approach and focus of these 5 areas, which will result in recommendations from the RIS. Community-centric approach includes a focus on building resilience in human health and well-being, helping communities plan for the impacts of climate change, equitable and community-centric engagement in our decision-making processes, and a recognition that poverty and the lack of access to basic services, including infrastructure, financial services, healthcare, and social protection, are very strong predictors of what makes people vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We know that no adaptation strategy can be successful without ensuring high vulnerability populations have the financial, technical, and institutional resources needed to adapt. And community-centric approach is really looking at the systems that help support access to those resources. Nature-based solutions and the recommendations that will fall within this core component look at how natural systems can buffer the impacts of climate change on our human communities and our infrastructure, but also recognizes that we need to safeguard our own ecosystems and promote biodiversity in ways that are climate resilient for now and for future generations. Infrastructure design and reinforcement focuses on the repair, hardening, and relocation of critical infrastructure that includes our roads and bridges, water and wastewater facilities, communications infrastructure, and energy infrastructure. Comprehensive early warning systems and emergency management and response. Having good comprehensive systems helps us reduce our physical damages and reduce our economic losses when we are hit with a disaster. We need to support our overall ability to reduce that long-term risk through things like early warning and effective emergency response, to reduce our risk and impact from climate disasters. And that's incorporated into the resilience implementation strategy and is recognized through the definition I shared on the last slide as well. Economic and environmental sustainability recognizes the interconnected nature of our climate resilience and economic viability we hold so dear and so important to us in Vermont, and seeks to really strengthen economic resilience for our businesses, our communities, and our working lands. Across all 5 of these core components is an acknowledgement that the main objective of any adaptation and resilience strategy, and really the focus of the resilience implementation strategy, is not only to implement standalone projects, it's to identify that an all-of-government approach is needed to incorporate resilience priorities into our decision-making, how we monitor and evaluate the impact of those decisions on our most vulnerable populations, and how we develop systems to ensure we can address challenges and adjust accordingly. And so I'll walk through a little bit more of the work we've been doing to develop the resilience implementation strategy. But as we see priorities come out that cut across these 5 core components, a lot of that is looped into how we as state government support resilience building on the ground through our systems and our approach. Next slide, please. So as we're looking at developing the resilience implementation strategy and how it could really get us to a place where we understand the full system of work that state government does to help build resilience to the impacts of climate change, and then understand the costs associated with that, we broke out the work of developing the RIS into 3 core phases. And the first phase was really focused on inventorying the existing work we do in state government to help build resilience. You know, a lot of the work that we do, we have fantastic programs that help us build resilience in our agricultural communities to not only the impacts of flooding, but the impacts of drought. We have systems that help ensure resilience and reliability in our energy and telecommunication structures. We have grant programs that help people buy out after major storms and disasters. So there's a lot of work happening across state government that helps us build resilience already. And so phase 1 was really looking at, let's inventory that work, understand where there are still gaps and opportunities to advance and scale that work, and then also ensure that that is aligned with the vision that we developed with the support of Vermonters through engagement efforts and through surveys we had online last year. Phase 2, which we are kind of nearing the completion of now, is looking at how do we categorize and really prioritize those opportunities, acknowledging there has to be some sort of prioritization and look at where we want to focus our efforts and our work and focus our identified funding that the Treasurer's Office will be looking at. We've worked with stakeholders and continue to work with stakeholders to refine those gaps and opportunities and identify actions and areas that may be needed to help fill those gaps. And then the last phase is really the partnership with the Treasurer's Office, looking to understand the costs for those prioritized gaps and opportunities, and then ultimately culminating in a report that will include both the information about where we see gaps, where there are actions to help build resilience, and then the cost and funding strategies associated with that. Next slide, please. So I'll go through briefly just some of the work we have done to kind of set the baseline for the development of the resilience implementation strategy and then where we're going from here. So as I shared, one of the first steps in developing the RIS was to inventory state work that has a nexus to climate resilience. Through an intake process and working with partners across state government, we conducted broad outreach to understand where there are initiatives, programs, grant opportunities, technical assistance that state government manages already that helps us build resilience. We asked questions. You'll see sort of summaries of those on the slide here. I won't read through all of them, but looking at understanding where existing work helps build resilience to particular climate hazards, flooding, wildfire, heavy wet snow, drought, where existing programs may already incorporate climate resilience as a primary outcome or a co-benefit. What scale is addressed through the work that state government does? Is it at a regional scale, a municipal scale, or is it implemented across the state? Is resilience incorporated into our decision-making or our budgeting and funding criteria? And how is that discussed and collaborated on with other partners? And then where do we see existing opportunities to help scale up the work so that we're really building off the success of programs that state government already does to build resilience? Next slide, please. So this resilience implementation strategy isn't just about identifying what's already happening. It's about finding those gaps and opportunities where we can strengthen Vermont's response to climate change. So as we reviewed the inventory of state government work, we grouped those under those 5 core components that I shared with you on a previous slide. And we assessed those through a series of lenses, looking at, does this group of work state government does address climate hazards? Do these initiatives cover phases of resilience, from both long-term risk reduction to maybe helping us better prepare our early warning and emergency management systems? Are we using the full ranges of tools that are available to state government? Policies, incentives, educational programs, conservation strategies, data and tools. Are funding and gaps, capacity gaps already being identified through work folks are doing, and where there are additional opportunities for collaboration or innovation in this work? We identified 330 different initiatives and programs across state government, 30 different organizations, departments, agencies, and work, and have compiled all of that into a database that we're hoping to make public once we finalize the resilience implementation strategy. Next slide, please. So after identifying those key opportunities, the next step was really turning those opportunities into action steps, which is the work we've been doing over the last couple of months. We held a big workshop with partners, including a mix of state agency staff and external partners, to identify concrete steps that could be taken to meet those opportunities and challenges we identified in the opportunity assessment. We asked questions about what's already working, how we can scale that work, and maybe if there are rules or policy changes that may be needed to help that work be more effective on the ground. We asked about where there might be opportunities and solutions that fit across other state efforts, acknowledging the work that's done to develop the Vermont State Hazard Mitigation Plan, the Comprehensive Energy Plan, Wildlife Action Plan, and many others that really pull climate resilience into the core foundation of those planning efforts and conversations. The goal of this workshop was to move beyond assessment and start thinking about implementation and really identifying what are those action steps that can help us meet those gaps, and where might we need additional funding and resources. How do we scale solutions, make things more actionable and implementable for partners across state government, and identify potential collaborations that will strengthen our resilience efforts more broadly. Next slide, please. So my last slide here, moving into next steps, we're looking at taking all of that input, continuing to work with partners to prioritize opportunities and actions, really identify where is the greatest need, where are those key areas where we can develop criteria and prioritize the focus of our work, and really how Vermont builds resilience to the impacts of climate change. And then I'll hand it over to Ashlynn in a moment, but the final step will be working with the Treasurer's Office to cost out and look at available funding and financing resources to tie to those prioritized efforts that come out of the resilience implementation strategy. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ashlynn.
Thanks, Marian. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashlynn Doyon. I'm the Director of Policy in the State Treasurer's Office. And as part of my portfolio, I handle our office's legislative agenda, as well as sort of special projects that come to us through intergovernmental partnerships or through legislative charges. And that's sort of what the resilience implementation strategy has come to be. And so it kind of falls in my purview in the office. Next slide, please. I wanted to start by just doing a little bit of stage setting. I think sometimes people ask, well, why is the Treasurer's Office sort of the state's banker, the person that deals with the money? Why are they involved in all of these climate conversations? And the reality is that the Treasurer's Office is frequently asked to sort of engage in a host of various topics related to the economy in Vermont, or just sort of the future outlook of the state's financial portfolio. As we have seen with the 2023 and the 2024 floods, climate impacts have the ability to really affect Vermont's sort of budgetary demands, affect businesses in our community, affect the lives of individual Vermonters, municipalities, et cetera. And so it makes sense that the Treasurer's Office is involved in these discussions and working to find some solutions for the state. We have historically been brought into projects in this space as well. There was a clean water report that happened prior to my tenure in the Treasurer's Office in 2023 and 2024. We received legislative charges to write these climate infrastructure finance reports on, sort of climate infrastructure financing coordination across the state, as well as the utilization of federal funding streams. We participated in the Transportation Cap and Invest study and report that was done this past year and submitted to the legislature, and we provided a commentary on viable approaches for Vermont's future. Of course, we are involved in the resilience implementation strategies I'm going to talk to you next, and we're also named in the implementation for the Climate Superfund Act, as Ben mentioned. Next slide, please. As Marian mentioned, the Resilience Implementation Strategy Phase 3 hasn't quite begun yet. And so while she did such a lovely job of detailing all of the incredible work that's gone into Phases 1 and 2, my comments are a little bit more broad strokes because I'm talking about sort of the plan that we anticipate implementing for the remainder of the project over the course of this spring and this summer. And so I'll mention that we are not just sort of picking up the project from the Climate Action Office cold. We have called a resilience investment working group together a few times over the course of the winter. And that group has begun to have some discussions about new and innovative funding and financing strategies for the priorities that we're going to identify with the RIS. They've sort of taken a spaghetti on the wall approach in terms of looking at things that have been done nationwide, been done in other countries, and created a bit of a list that we're just sort of starting to comb through and assess viability for Vermont. And so I'll say a few words about sort of the plan that we have in place to do this evaluation and costing exercise once we determine the priorities through the first 2 phases of the RIS, and then we'll go into questions and answers, and that's probably the best way to talk about these kinds of things. So in terms of the priorities that we anticipate coming out of the first 2 phases, I think that what we'll end up seeing is probably a subset of priority investment areas and actions for each of the components that Marian talked about. And so because resilience work statewide is so complex and so nuanced, there will be sort of an array of priorities that we're looking at. The Treasurer's Office is likely going to evaluate them in 2 phases. We will take a look at an initial sort of list of priorities and develop a costing methodology from there. It's likely that each priority has its own methodology. From our observations, our involvement in the steering committee in the RIS so far, we are anticipating that there are a couple of different themes that emerge. Of course, there are going to be a set of policy-related actions that the state might engage in that may not necessarily have direct costs associated with them, or they might have sort of more de minimis staffing costs associated with them. There is also sort of this category of post-climate disaster or post-crisis actions and flexibility that's needed. And then that is different from sort of the proactive, ongoing funding sources for other sets of priorities. So I know that that's broad strokes, but I hope that it provides a little bit of color. We'll be doing 2 things that Marian alluded to. We'll be evaluating sort of the current funding sources and whether or not they are still sufficient for the priorities that we come up with for the scope of state investment that we think needs to occur. I think that we can probably predict that dollars are limited and the number of actions that we could take to make Vermont more resilient in the face of climate change is really infinite. And so it's really likely that the resources that we have currently available are not going to be enough for the work that we think should be happening in this space. And so that leads us to sort of the second thing. And that's where we will develop over the course of the next couple of months some recommendations for funding implementation efforts on an ongoing basis. we are thinking that these funding implementation efforts might span sort of any federal funding opportunities that might still be available, potentially some public-private partnerships, new financing strategies that maybe we haven't considered in Vermont yet before, and then also possibly, just additional funding requests that are informed by sort of an economic evaluation of a cost benefit analysis for doing this kind of resilience work. We'll be looking at, in terms of the methodology, some of these priority actions will already have unknown costs associated with them. Perhaps it's a priority that we've requested from the legislature to do previously, and we haven't received that money, and so there's been a clearly articulated number in the past. Perhaps there are comparable projects that have already been done statewide that we can pull from, maybe add some inflators or regional cost differences to come up with numbers. There are also going to be some things that are quite broad that may be quite difficult to cost out. And in that sense, we'll just have to sort of implement the most practical methodology that we can think of to arrive at a number. I think that from the treasurer's perspective, the ultimate goal is to sort of come forward in the wake of this project with a goal of the state sort of investing more in resilience strategies and in a way that is in line with the sort of plan that the RIS puts forth after having done all of this work with the inventory and the opportunities assessment, so that we can be really strategic with those additional investments. So I definitely have that broad picture in mind, and others in the treasurer's office that I'm working with on this have that broad picture and end goal in mind as well. I think that's all that I sort of wanted to mention on this point. The only thing I'll add, and this maybe goes back to my previous slide a little bit when I talk about the work that the treasurer's office has already been asked to do. When we did the clean water report, I think it was back in 2017, that resulted in tens of millions of dollars annually being invested in clean water, where that wasn't happening before. When the treasurer's office did the 2 climate infrastructure financing reports in 2023 and 2024, in each we laid out a series of recommendations and that we thought should take place, and many of those recommendations have been implemented. For example, in the treasurer's office, there's a new credit facility that's been created with 2.5% of the state's average daily cash balance for climate infrastructure related projects. As part of the first climate infrastructure financing report, we've really identified municipal technical assistance, or the lack thereof, as a barrier to a lot of these resilience projects getting implemented at a municipality level. And now we are working with ACCD and UVM on a municipal technical assistance working group that I think is going to have some really tangible impacts. We also identified through the climate infrastructure financing report that there's a Safeguarding Tomorrow revolving loan fund through FEMA that actually hasn't been affected by some of the Trump administration's recent cuts, that the state wasn't yet taking advantage of, and we're about to submit an application. And Vermont Emergency Management, in partnership with the Vermont Bond Bank, is about to submit an application for that revolving loan fund. We hosted in the summer last year and the fall 2 large climate roundtable events. And at the one in November in particular, we were really able to all come together and sort of start to forward think about ways in which the federal administration might impact federal funding streams. And so I say all of that just to sort of recognize that these large bodies of work really do have tangible impacts in the end, and that I'm really optimistic about the direction that the RIS is taking us, and we're excited to get to work on phase 3. So with that, I'll hand it back over to the NRC team to facilitate the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much. Great information. We do have a few questions that I'll go through, and please add additional questions that you have, or we might be getting you out a little early today. So the first question from Alexandra was, can you give an example, and I believe this will go to Marian, of an early warning system in Vermont? What are your recommendations for smaller river towns? If no early warning system exists, what sort of systems could be developed?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. So I'll start by saying, early warning systems can look like many different things. It can look like some sort of alert system that shares out with members of your community ahead of some sort of event or disaster. It could look like, a post on Facebook or a message in WhatsApp group that's been prepared in advance to help people understand what impacts might look like. A couple of examples of sort of early warning systems that the state supports that are accessible to municipalities. The first, which hopefully folks are already aware with, but something called VT Alert, which is a messaging system that the state supports that you can subscribe to get information and alerts all the way from, traffic events in your community up to weather alerts and other type of disaster and emergency alert systems. It's also accessible to municipalities to take on and use as a structure by which they can send out alerts just to folks within their community. That also helps enable the messaging from National Weather Service that folks may get when storms are coming, when there's potential flooding impacts that we might be seeing in communities. Some of the creative ways that communities are starting to take that messaging and alert to another level is through a handful of tools. The first of which is something called the National Water Model, and this is a federal tool that looks at hydraulic modeling and a framework to understand observed and future forecasted stream flow. So you mentioned being a river community. The National Water Model, which is continuing to be built out, I'm not sure if it covers the entire state yet, but they're building it out currently, is an online system that you could look at to understand future flow impacts based on historical weather events. And what's really interesting and helpful about the National Water Model is it includes historical data and information. So you could look back at a flooding event that impacted your community 5 to 10 years ago and see what exactly those numbers looked like, what the flows looked like on the river in your community. And we see some towns actually taking that information and incorporating it into their communication channels. So for example, Montpelier, as they start to see, when they see flooding events or forecasts for heavy rain events, they're sending messages out using VT Alert to their community to say, we're anticipating flooding, the river levels might get up to this level. If it gets up to this level, here's what we might see in terms of flooding in our downtown. And so that's really a way we're seeing kind of incorporation of tools that help us better understand and predict systems related to flooding, future stream flow, in with early warning systems to get information out to community members better and in a way that feels much more accessible to them because they understand, oh yeah, I remember this previous event and here's what flooding looked like, and that's what we might be seeing in the future. So those are a couple of examples for flooding. I will say some of what we're looking at for the resilience implementation strategy is what can we do better and where do we need to expand that work. And we'll say on the topic of landslides, the Vermont Geologic Survey, which sits within the Agency of Natural Resources, is trying to move forward with some landslide modeling. And their hope is to eventually be able to tie that to National Weather Service alert systems to provide a better kind of prediction system, forecasting system for where landslides might be impacting communities tied to weather alerts. So those are all examples of sort of early warning systems and alert systems that already exist or we're seeing being incorporated into municipal operations.
Thanks, Marian. And I just saw, just building on that, are there ways that people without internet access are accessing information through that? I think that's just building on that same question, and then I'll go to some others people have.
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly with National Weather Service, the National Water Model, and some of those simulations, you do need internet access to be able to access it. VT Alert is a system by which you get text messages to your phone. So you don't necessarily need internet access, but I think having cell access is obviously part of what makes what allows you to get access to your alert systems, to your text messages to your phone. I think other ways, and we'll say actually, to really look at your community's local emergency management plan, which requires identifying how they will communicate and alert members in their community who maybe do or do not have access to internet. I mean, neighbor to neighbor networks, conversations about having neighborhood folks being able to check in on others when there are alert systems coming in that may need alert. Certainly when there are near-term evacuation orders or alerts when it comes to flooding, that's when you start to see folks going door to door to talk to people. But those are really systems and structures that are set up at the municipal level. So I would encourage you to take a look at your municipality's local emergency management plan for that information.
Thank you. All right, we'll jump around a little just so we can bring some of the other speakers in, but I think we'll have time to get to every question so far. So this might be one, Ashlynn, you might be able to help with, just talking about how municipal support might come in. The questioner had asked about being competitive grants or some other structures. So maybe just a little more on what you see as possibilities for municipal support.
Sure. So I can talk about, because I also see that Anne had a couple of questions in the chat that I think sort of go into this as well. We're very cognizant of the demands placed on municipalities in the wake of a crisis. In particular, the resilience implementation strategy is focused, I think, on, long-term resilience efforts of the state at a higher level. But in the wake of a crisis, the state treasurer's office definitely thinks about municipalities. In 2023 and 2024, we did a couple of things. We advanced state payments to municipalities of particularly the education payments that are supposed to go out in October. We advanced them in August so that municipalities had short-term funds, cash flow available for immediate repair projects. Similarly, we used the sort of first iteration of that 2.5% credit facility that I mentioned to work with the bond bank to provide short-term bridge money at a very, very, very low interest rate for municipalities while they awaited FEMA reimbursements. And so I, can't speak yet to the specifics of whether or not any of the priorities coming out of the RIS will have to do with bolstering support to municipalities either in the wake of a crisis or proactively. But I can say that it's definitely a theme on our minds in the treasurer's office, and very cognizant of the sort of need for support and assistance at that level, as well as, sort of additional investment at the larger state level.
Thanks. Maybe back to Marian. Could you talk a little bit more about the stakeholder outreach that went on? There was a question specifically about were municipalities engaged, and maybe just more broadly, like the type of engagement that happens. We have a bigger picture.
Yes, absolutely. So we'll just start to say, when we kicked off the resilience implementation strategy and sort of in the first phase of work as we were developing a vision, the vision includes kind of key outcome-based priorities that are really guiding how we prioritize the work for the RIS, the outcomes for the actions, and ultimately the priorities that will be shared and partnering with the treasurer's office to cost out. That was done through a handful of kind of public engagement events that we hosted virtually, as well as the posting of an online survey that we shared through the Climate Action Office's newsletter, which once I stop talking, I'll put a link in the chat for folks to subscribe to, as that's a great way to get information about the resilience implementation strategy, but got a wide range of feedback from local level partners, municipal partners on that work. For the stakeholder workshop that I mentioned, which I think is what this question is referring to, yes, we did have municipal participation and support at that workshop. It was a fully in-person workshop, and so we had some capacity limitations. We're so used to a virtual time where we can have hundreds of folks on meetings, but the virtual workshop, we identified municipal partners working with our steering committee and other folks to have municipal partners there to be able to represent and speak to their direct connection to state government work that we were really focused on for the RIS. And then we'll say, this isn't that kind of, that wasn't the end of our engagement. I think as we get closer to a finalized set of priorities, we'll go back out to partners and seek additional engagement and partnership with folks who work closely with municipalities like VCAN. And then the last thing I'll say is, we've done engagement and sort of done direct outreach with municipalities, but also had participation at the workshop from a lot of community-based organizations, long-term recovery groups, and others who support municipalities and really responding to and recovering from disasters. And those are really important voices to have, as we often see those folks providing additional capacity and support to communities to think about how they build climate resilience into their systems.
Thank you. All right, let's turn to Ben next for a couple questions that came up on the Climate Superfund. So there's one from Deborah and Robert asking about the Trump executive order and kind of the ramping rhetoric around that, and ordering the U.S. Attorney General within 60 days to report back on actions and looking to stop enforcement of state laws. So Ben, could you just speak to our understanding of where that stands, what work Vermont is doing to get ready for anything that might come? And then there's another question that we can do after that.
Yeah, happy to. I'm joined by my daughter here who's homesick today. I will say, I think, everything that Trump is doing is escalating in his second term. So I think that's an accurate description of the rhetoric that he put in that executive order. In terms of, are we prepared? I will say, if you've read anything in the media about this, the Attorney General, Charity Clark, has been very clear that her office is on top of this and is not concerned about the executive order as she described it. And this is, how a lot of Trump's executive orders play out. It really doesn't have any force of law. It's essentially a memo to the U.S. Attorney General saying, look into this and do stuff. It's not actually a traditional executive order, more of an email that he signed in a ceremony. So that's not to say that the U.S. Attorney General couldn't, try to be problematic, but ultimately, this is a lawsuit where all of the legal issues are already on the table. There are already powerful special interests like the, oil industry that are weighing in against Vermont. So the U.S. Attorney General trying to involve herself in it doesn't really fundamentally change the playing field. So short answer, yes, our Attorney General is prepared for this.
Thanks, Ben. And then there was a question about what is the current status of the funding for the Superfund Act? Yeah,
so there's not a standalone bill on that. That would be part of the state budget that the Senate Appropriations Committee is finalizing their draft of right now. It's already gone through the House. And the whole state Senate will probably be considering, I would imagine, next week. So just to quickly recap, the feasibility report laid out $1.5 million in asks across the two, Agency of Natural Resources and the Treasurer's Office. The Treasurer's Office requested $700,000 for consultants and $125,000 for one staffer to oversee that project. And then ANR had an additional request for consultants and funding for an attorney. It looks like what's going to happen is the Treasurer's Office will get most, but not all of the money that they've requested for consultants. From our perspective, that will still allow them to do quite a lot of work on this, though they, it's possible they would have an additional ask next year. The ANR asks, at least as of the last time I looked at the draft budget, have not been funded. They are on the record saying that if they get their funding for consultants, especially with the 12-month delay that I described earlier, next year, they will still be able to do their work in a timely fashion. We are still hopeful that the attorney position would be funded. That's important both from a legal defense standpoint and from a implementation standpoint. And I'm not sure if that's something that Senate Appropriations will potentially be adding later today or tomorrow. And is it still a moment, Ben, when people weighing in to support that is helpful, or have we kind of missed the window? Yeah, I would say yes. Thank you for the question. Where things are at, in the Senate, it's fairly advanced. If it is included, and it looks like it's going to be, it's going to have to go back to the House, and then ultimately what they do is, call the conference committee where there's a few reps and a few senators who hash out the differences. And this will be one of the differences because funding for this was not included in the House budget. And so certainly good for your senators to hear from you in the closing days of the Senate's consideration of their version of the budget. And even more important that representatives hear that this is really important to Vermonters. So give the State House a call. I think 828-2228 is basically the front desk of the State House. You can just say, here's my name, here are my elected officials that I want to leave a message for. If it's not too busy and where you live, but aren't sure your elected officials, they might even be able to help you with that, although that's not always possible. And just let them know, you want to leave a message for your reps and senators, urging them to fund the Climate Superfund Act's implementation.
Great. Thank you so much. And you all asked the exact perfect number of questions, so we were able to get to all of them. So thank you all again for being here. At this time when there's so much going on, I think showing up and engaging in the variety of ways I know you all are is so important. It was inspiring to see people out for Earth Day and activism for civil rights yesterday at the State House as well. And so just keep it up, keep making your voices heard. And thank you so much to our panelists for sharing their expertise and updates today. Really appreciate it. And just put in the chat, but final reminder that the last winter webinar series for VCAN, and it's great to see that spring finally seems to have arrived, but that's going to be May 7th at noon, and getting an update from the Climate Action Office, and so on. So please, you can register there. I'm sure we'll send out lots of reminders, but great to see you all and enjoy this sunny day. Take care.